What are questions you have about the Old Testament that you still just don't get, don't understand? Anyone?
I got a lot of them, but you don't want them.
I do.
No, you don't. Sorry.
Okay.
It's just me rereading back through.
Okay, that's fine. You got one?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Throw one out
I
there.
got some. You know that.
As long as it relates to the class, right?
Okay.
Not like where aliens come from.
Okay. 1 Samuel 31:4
Okay.
says Samuel killed himself.
Okay.
Then in 2 Samuel 1:10 it says someone else killed Saul.
Yep. So what's the problem?
Huh?
So what's the problem? Okay, so there are two different views. At the end of 1 Samuel, we have the recording of King Saul's death, where it says he fell on his own spear.
Mm-hmm.
And then a servant, right, of the Amorites comes, and there's a big war going on, battle going on, right? And he shows up and he sees King Saul dead. There's two different things. Danny, I don't know if you've heard any more than the two, but the major views are, one, Saul did throw himself on a spear. He, just because he threw himself on a spear didn't mean he was fully dead. And this guy finished the job. Okay? There's probably three. Two, he found Saul dead. He thought, oh, I know the tension between Saul and David, David being the new king. I can take credit for it and bring it to David, and thinking he's going to get a reward, when really, what does he get? Or those are really the main two options.
Actually taught like David for 1 year.
Yeah.
But that was the one that I leaned toward, was that he was probably leaning into the tension there.
Yeah, he was probably lying, and even if he did finish Saul off, he left that out in the retelling. He took credit and took claim, right? And he thought he would get a reward for that, or some kind of position or protection, because remember, there is a battle, and he is a foreigner as well. They're actually at war with his people, but he found himself in enemy territory, found King Saul dead, thinking he was going to get a boost.
It kind of helps underline the whole thing that you see with David, and what is it, 1 Samuel 24 and 26, the opportunities that he has to kill Saul and doesn't, and even seeing him still as God's anointed after his death. If somebody is bold enough to come up and say that he's the one who killed Saul,
Whether he did it or not.
there's no judge or jury. It's an immediate execution there.
Yeah. So I don't think there's a discrepancy. I think he's trying to retell it in a way that makes him look favorable. And whether he did it or didn't, the outcome would have been the same. I don't think David killed him because he thought he was lying. I think David killed him because he thought he would claim to kill the Lord's anointed, whether he did it or not, and thought it was a good thing and not a reprehensible thing. Okay? Anyone else? Or any other questions?
I got questions.
All right, let's throw them out.
Okay, 1 Samuel 16:18.
Okay?
When they first bring David in, because Saul has the evil spirit,
Yep.
to play the harp.
Okay?
Okay. Then when he comes back and when he's around that time to do Goliath or whatever, Saul acts like he don't know who he is. Explain that. Because he said, "Whose son is this?"
Yeah. So remember Saul, okay, so there's a couple options. One, I don't necessarily think the Bible is always so chronological, it's more thematic at times. Meaning it could have been rearranged to, like sometimes like when you're telling a story, you may go ahead in the future, tell this story, but then you want to emphasize something, so you back up a little bit, and then you restart telling it from, you know what I'm saying? So there's part of the story where it's trying to get David as anointed as king. It's trying to show Saul and his failure and David as king, and then we kind of come back and we're kind of backtracking, and you're retelling the story. You understand what I'm saying? So that's a possibility. Secondly, how much attention do you think Saul gave David as just one of his many servants in his house? like to detail who he is. And you ever see somebody in a different environment than what you normally saw them in before? Like you see them at work, right? People are in their work uniform, and then all of a sudden you see the people in real life, and you're like, wait, you're Betty Sue? You look so much different dressed up, not in your work uniform. That could be a possibility. I think there are several times in Samuel where it will go ahead and tell the story, what it's trying to tell, and then all of a sudden you're back maybe a couple years back in history because it's restarting, the chronology. That's what I think. But
It just seemed weird because it's like you don't know who he is, and he's been there.
And he also has that distressing spirit, so he's also, And then there's the possibility, who is this son of Jesse? It's not that he doesn't know him, but like, why is he so important? What is it about him, right? He's asking more of a rhetorical question. How is he able to accomplish this when all of my other men could not? Right? Who's his father? Where'd this faith come from? Where'd this courage come from? Those kind of stuff. But all right, let's try to. That's good. That's a good kind of icebreaker. Throw some questions out there. What we're going to do is we're going to look at this timeline. If you don't, I think it's on the back of this. See this? What I'm going to do, and what we're going to do, is what a lot of people don't. I believe once you get the Old Testament storyline down, and you know what event happens after the other, after the other, after the other, when you're reading, it makes a whole lot more sense when you're in Samuel and you know what has happened before, like you know the story up to this point, and you know where it's going. Because then you can start, when you're reading Samuel, you can start seeing, we're picking up on this theme again, right? Or we're introducing this theme, and this is going to come in later. Okay, and so that's one of the things I've been trying to do over the last, 16 weeks, trying to get you guys to embed some of these themes into your mind that just keep coming up and playing over and over and over again. But if you don't know the chronology either, it can be hard to, what's going on right now? Okay? So we're going to break the Bible down into sections. And the very first section of Scripture is Genesis through Deuteronomy. Okay? And Genesis is your major section. Genesis is broken up into two major storylines, chapters 1 through 11, and then 12 through 50. So chapters 1 through 11 is the universal beginnings. We talked about this quite a bit. I'm not going to go over too much about it, but it's really giving us a preview of why did we need the Israel story. You need the Israel story because all of humanity has failed, and so in chapter 12, God begins the Jewish story. So the first 11 chapters isn't necessarily Jewish. It isn't just for Jews. It's the story of mankind, how we all failed. Okay? Starting in Genesis chapter 12, it's where does this Israel family come from? Remember, a lot of these things are being written down years after these events. Moses wrote the first 5 books, and he's retelling the story for the people who are now going into the promised land so they know, where did you come from? Where does this God come from? Why can you trust this God? And here's some stories that have brought us up to this point. Okay? So in Genesis, your major key characters are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and who's the last major character at the end of the book of Genesis? Joseph. Remember, the last 15 chapters is Joseph going into slavery. But what happens to him in slavery? Things actually go well for him, and God actually cares for him, and God actually brings him up to be head over all of Egypt besides Pharaoh. What do you think that theme is starting to develop? Why is that emphasized? This idea of captivity, being blessed in captivity, being put in captivity, necessarily not even sins of your own, and yet God's still seeing you through captivity. Doesn't that seem to be a consistent theme throughout Scripture? And we kind of get a beginning of that. That's what this family is going to have to go through over and over and over again. Okay, so that's Genesis. Now Exodus through Deuteronomy, somebody give me a 2 or 3 sentence summary of Exodus to Deuteronomy. I know that may be hard, but if you can do it, it'll actually help you when you're reading. Someone give me a story of just the story, not necessarily what is Leviticus about or what is Numbers about, but what's the progression from the beginning of the book of Exodus to the end of Deuteronomy? Yeah. Leaving, wandering, and we'll say promised land. Okay? They leaving Egypt, because they've been in Egypt. That's the end of Genesis story. They're leaving. They are wandering through the wilderness because of their lack of faith. Remember when they go into the wilderness, the spies are sent. They lose faith. They have lack of faith, so they wander for 40 years. They get a bunch of laws and commandments, and then he prepares them for that second generation to go into the promised land. So you've got the Bible's sometimes strange, because sometimes all of a sudden in 11 chapters you'll have 2,000 years of history, and then for 6 books you may have 40 years of history or 120 years of history. So we've got to remember how long, what's taking place during these books. Like the book of Deuteronomy probably was a week-long sermon of his last kind of sermons, getting them ready to go in the promised land. Some people even think he probably did all that in a day. Which, if you know anything like what Ezra did, they stood up from day till night for a whole week, the entire week of Passover, teaching the law in and out, rereading the entire law. So it's not something that is unheard of in Jewish history. And then so you're getting into the promised land. So what is the next book that comes up in the Bible, the next major section, is Joshua. And what is Joshua all about? The book of Joshua.
Taking Moses' place, really.
Well, that's Joshua at the beginning. He's kind of becoming the second Moses.
He's taking them into the promised land, and they are to be divided into the land that they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And they do follow until Joshua dies.
Yeah, but the entire book of Joshua is them conquering the promised land. And they're conquering it for all the different 12 tribes. And they go and conquer the land that God allotted all the tribes and gives them their land, right? And how many people and where they're at, where they can't, right? And they don't get all of it because they don't drive everybody out, right? God promised them this much. They only got, let's say, 90%, maybe even less. But it was if you do this, I will give you this. So if they did not do it, then what did they not get all of? They didn't get all of it, but they got majority of it. So much so that they carved out a territory for themselves, all of the Mediterranean, I draw that all the time, right? The Mediterranean, the Fertile Crescent, we'll call it, all of that area, and they are starting to become a nation. Right now they're 12 tribes, and God is working to build a nation. But for 400 years, after they conquer all the land, after Joshua dies, what do they struggle with? What's the next book? Judges. And what is the entire story of Judges about? They've got the land, but they can't keep it. And why can't they keep it? Because they lack faith. Every time. Now, once again, the book of Judges is not, the entire nation is not going through all of those miniature captivities. It's actually, this tribe is doing it, this tribe is doing it, this tribe is doing it. They're not one nation yet. They are 12 individual tribes. Okay? They're supposed to be united, but they're still very much divided. Kind of like their brothers, right? Joseph and his brothers were very divided. You see that going throughout. And so for 400 years, there's just these periods of in and out, little miniature captivities that all the little tribes go through. Okay? And then Samuel comes along, and we're going to kind of skip the book of Ruth. Ruth is thrown in there. It's kind of like the highlight, but just we're going to skip that for chronology's sake. So then we get all of this period is bringing us up to here. This is about Abraham got the promise in about 1876 BC. bringing us all the way to when Saul was actually crowned king, is 1050, 1051 BC. How many years in between Abraham getting the covenant, telling them they're going to be a nation, they've conquered the promised land, how many years until they have their first king? About 800 years, right? Almost 900 years. And so we've got 900 years of history that we just covered. And that's how many books? 7 books. Ruth, throw in there 8 books. Now you're going to have 1st and 2nd Samuel, which take up lengthwise almost as much as when you do 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. You're going to slow way down for about 300-400 years, and you're going to spend all this time on 3 major characters plus their sons. So you're going to have Saul, David, Solomon, and then king, northern king. And when you're reading Kings, it's the most confusing book to read, one of the most confusing books out there to read. You want to know why? Because you want to talk about jumping chronology, all of a sudden you have followed 3 southern kings in a row, and you've advanced maybe 70 years, and then it'll jump back to a northern king, and it will go back and then almost catch up, or not quite catch up, then jump to 1 southern king, then 1 northern king, then 2 southern kings, and you're like, who wrote this, right? You know. So Kings is a very confusing chronology to try to gather. But let's go back to Samuel. Okay, so 1st and 2nd Samuel, who can give me what 1st Samuel all the way to the end of 2nd Samuel covers? 2 huge books. What's the major storyline in 1st and 2nd Samuel?
The king, which is Saul.
Okay.
No good. And then David becoming the king. And then David following God until he messes up.
Yeah. And so we have our united kingdom. They finally all unite under Saul. They've got their first king. Now, they have spent how many years divided and fractured and having no real central figure who's guiding them as a nation? 800 plus years? Saul comes in. He unites them. Does anyone remember the first event that happens where he unites all the people? What is his first real, where he gathered, he tells all the nations, you better come and assist me right now? Well, yeah. So remember, there was a foreign, Jabesh Gilead. There was a foreign, the Amorites, I think it was the Amorites, who threatened Jabesh Gilead with that if you don't surrender, they were going to cut off like the right ear or the right thumb of every, one of their men, or pluck out their eye, one of those. Saul hears about it. Saul hears about it. He cuts up an animal into 12 pieces, sends them out, and says, if you don't come and assist under one banner, then I'm going to cut you up like this animal. And all the nations kind of come together. And that's really your first, all the nations after they've, are as big as they are, come together and work together under one king. Well, most of your book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, I don't know why this extends out in here, is literally just about the life of David. Why is David so important? Why would David get so much screen time in the Old Testament? He's a king after God's own heart. He was like a Messiah, and he becomes a type of Christ. Because Christ was going to come through the lineage of David. What were other David's major accomplishments that are emphasized? What's the big... Where do they worship? Where's the temple located? Jerusalem. Who unites them in Jerusalem? Who calls it the city of God? Who makes the plans for the temple? Now, he doesn't build the temple. He creates all the plans for the temple, lays them out for Solomon. And then we get Solomon. Starts off great, doesn't he? How does Solomon start? What's one of the first stories we read about Solomon? Besides David taking vengeance on all the people, he didn't want to, have to. He prayed God for wisdom, and God grants him wisdom, and all the people around the world, right, come to gather around Solomon. He probably writes many of our proverbs during this time, and then Solomon gets into what? What starts after he builds a temple, consecrates a temple? What does Solomon spend the rest of his life, a lot of it doing?
Trying to figure out what life's all about.
Well, yeah.
Just let it go on.
Politics. How many wives did he have?
300.
Over 700 wives.
700.
How long do you think it took to gather 700 wives?
About 2 years.
Huh? Oh, yeah, he was.
I would have married this person because we made an agreement.
Yeah. There were political wives, but there was also, he made slaves, wives. Yeah, he did not turn out to be the best. So much so that, remember, Jeroboam comes to Rehoboam after Solomon dies, and what does he ask of Jeroboam? Or what does Jeroboam ask of Rehoboam?
And not be so tough. Like, take the thumb off.
Please, just relax, right? Chill. Solomon, he was harsh. He became a harsh king. So you've got 40 years of a decent king, and even David during those 40 years didn't always live up. The first half of his life was great. After Bathsheba, David kind of does this. He has some moments, but even the end of 2 Samuel, where it's the end of David's life, he's got to end with offering up a sacrifice to God on an altar. He's got to make a sin offering, because the very last thing we have recorded is he takes a census. Chronicles tells us Satan is the one who encouraged him to do it. And God goes, well, now I'm going to have to punish your people. Pick what punishment, right? Because he didn't trust God. Then you've got Solomon, takes up his wives, he dies. So we got 120 years of united kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. And immediately after Solomon dies, the kingdom is shattered in half. Not even in half. 10 northern tribes become, what is their name described after Solomon most of the time? Israel. So they become Israel. The 2 southern tribes become Judah. So when you're reading after the time of it's in 1 Kings, after the time of Solomon's death, and you read this is the king of Israel, or this is the king of Judah, they're not talking about the same place. Israel is the king of the north. Judah is the king of the south. And on your sheet, I showed this last week, this right here above, these are all the kings of the north. What does red symbolize? Bad kings. Look at the kings down south. What does green symbolize? Good. Now, how many good ones did we have? Now you have to count. Yeah, and there were some that were decent, right? Some of them, if they're not marked, they were kind of good and bad. But even the good ones don't have the best of kingships anyway. They're not all good. So God, this is what we're getting at. This is the story we're seeing. Patriarchal age. This is your time of the Exodus. This is the time of conquest, where they're finally conquering the promised land that God promised them. Then you get to Samuel. They're there. God gives them a king because they asked for a king. And for 120 years, they're sort of united. Though even during Saul's reign, what does he do with half of his life? He spends it chasing David. And what is he not doing when he's chasing David? He's not defeating all the Philistines and their armies, which is interesting. Guess what David is doing a lot of times when he's on the run? Who is he fighting? He's fighting Philistines, and he's fighting battles, and he's defeating them. Sometimes joins up with them, but that's another point. But he's defeating all the people that Saul should be while he's chasing David. And then David spends his life, he's a pretty good king, right? Unites them, gets the plans of the temple, has some mishaps. Solomon comes, once again, not the greatest of kings. It wasn't a fun. Probably the first half of Solomon's life may have been, oh, he's a good king. Last half of Solomon's life, which 20 years of a horrible king, that's a long time, isn't it? I mean, how many years have we been dealing in our culture right now where it really started taking a downward, I mean, like really bad? I'm just thinking of even the last 5. And the last 5 has felt like 100, right, political-wise. If you're just looking at how much has changed and how bad it's gotten, imagine 20 years, okay? So in the 1930, we split, and when you're reading your Bible, it will go through all the chronology first. And then we start hitting the major and minor prophets. Now, the major and minor prophets are not happening after the time of kings. 90% of them are happening during the time of all these kings. If you're reading of Rehoboam and Asa and Joash and Uzziah and Jotham, all those people, all these prophets, and they tell you, when you go read a prophet, it'll tell you this was during the 3rd year of this king. So what you need to do is, when you're reading Nahum or you're reading Isaiah, find out what king it was written in. Go find it in the book of Kings or Chronicles. Read a little bit of that king, read that story. And then when you read the prophet and you see what he says, it makes a little bit more sense. Because a lot of people go, well, I don't really know what's going on in Nahum or Zephaniah or these. Well, go read. It tells you what time period it's talking about. Go read about that time period a little bit. Go read about the sins that are named, and you're probably going to go, oh, that's why he's saying that. That's why he's doing that. Now, sometimes we have some prophets that don't mention a king at all. And you're just kind of going, I'm going to take a really good guess about when this is going on. Okay? So from 930 BC, Israel lasts to 722 BC. How many years did the northern tribe last? 930 to 722. About 200 years. Just under 200 years, right? So Syrian captivity, I've explained this probably several times. How did the Assyrians, when they take people captive, what do? The Assyrians. Huh? They separate them. They disperse them. They bring people from other nations and they mix them so the next generation has really no allegiance to any person but being Assyrian. And what people group come out of this captivity that Jesus meets in the New Testament? The Samaritans. Okay. They're the half-breed. They're probably not even half. They're probably mixed blood. But they're ones who have figured out somewhere along the way their Jewish heritage and have at least tried to honor God. Okay? Now they've got some things messed up, but Jesus acknowledges that, hey, with all that they've been through and the faith that woman displays compared to being in Jerusalem, she had a better faith than most of your Pharisees and Sadducees, right? So they don't last very long. Do they ever come back fully? Do we ever conquer that land back? No. So just think of the 10 northern tribes as they're gone. Now Judah. This is your major storyline. You've got some Israel, you've got some prophets. Elijah and Elisha are actually to your northern tribes, right? But most of your story is going to follow Judah. Why would it follow Judah? Well, they come back. And what about Judah is so special? The tribe. Yeah. The Christ is going to come through the tribe of Judah, so they've got to come back, and they've got to kind of keep their chronology. That is why during the Babylonian captivity, which is about 586 BC, how do the Babylonians deal with captivity? What did they do when they took all of Israel and brought them back to Babylon? They basically gave them a refugee camp, right? And when Ezekiel, when he's preaching to a refugee camp, They live in their own little people group, and yet they get to buy and sell and build businesses and build homes. They literally build their whole community like they did in Egypt. And eventually, what king, after 70 years of captivity, which you've got Daniel and Esther in that, Daniel's in captivity, Esther's in captivity, what king sends them back after 70 years of captivity? King Cyrus, who is, what nation does he serve? He's a Persian king. Remember, there's a Babylonian, then there's the Medo-Persians, then there's the Grecian, right? Greek. And who's after Greek? Rome. Okay? So those are the empires that at the end of the captivity, leading up to the time of Jesus, and when you're reading Daniel, there's actually a prophecy of Alexander the Great and his generals and all of that historical stuff that will come. All right, but they come back 70 years. And who is the leader of the first wave back from captivity? Who's leading the people? It's a really fun name. It's almost like you're blowing bubbles. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was the king that brought them into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian king that made them captive. I'm talking about what Jewish person, there's really two, but one usually gets mentioned more, who brings the first wave of captives back to rebuild the temple. Zerubbabel. It's almost like, I'm blowing bubbles. I don't know if that helped or not. Zerubbabel, and I think it's Joshua or Jeshua, depending on if you have the NIV or the ESV, priests. And they come back to build the temple, and it starts off good, doesn't it? It starts off really good. They lay the foundation. They all celebrate. But what stops that celebration? And what book is that happening in, by the way? That's the book of Ezra. Ezra does not come in until like Ezra chapter 8, which is 50 years after they initially return. But when they lay the foundation of the temple, why do they stop building?
Is that where the older ones come in and complain?
The older ones, they remember Solomon's temple, and it was huge. It was massive. The younger ones never saw Solomon's temple. What?
How long they live?
Huh?
How
Well,
long they live?
70 years. Imagine if you were a young boy, right?
Okay.
And you were brought over, right? Or they were told about it, and there's still the remains of it, right? When they come back. So they remember the glory of Solomon's temple. They think the new temple is not big enough. There's no glory to be found. There's some opposition that comes in, right? Then they rebuild. Ezra gets sent back. They finally rebuild. They rebuild it in record time. The king's like, there must be God behind you if you're building it this quick. They rebuild the temple. And then probably about 30 years later, Nehemiah, who is still over in Babylon, what does he hear about? He hears that the temple walls, or the walls around the temple in the city, have fallen or were never built. There's some discrepancy there. And he asks the king, can I go back and rebuild? He comes back, he rebuilds the walls, and at the very end of Nehemiah, what you find in Jerusalem are people from all nations who are living, and that's literally the last historical thing that happens in the Old Testament. That's all of our chronology. That's the summary. Now, are there a lot of little stories in between that? Absolutely. But that's the gist of everything that happens. That's the narrative. And the overall arcing narrative is how many good periods of Israel history do we have? How many really good, faithful people do you actually find throughout these 2,000 years of history? It's a sliver. Majority of the nation, majority of the people did not obey God, did not have a faith in God, didn't even want anything to do with God. And a part of the problem, I believe, and you read some of the prophets, is they were born into this. They didn't ask for it. They didn't want to be a part of it. You were just, if you were born a Jew, this is your God, these are your laws. Well, why? Because this is your God and these are your people, and you have to. That's one of the promises of the prophets is you will no longer be taught it. No man will have to teach you it, because for you to be a part of it, you yourself chose to be a part of it. You don't have to be taught why you're a Christian. Hopefully, right? That's why a lot of Christian kids who grow up in the church struggle with their own identity of faith. Because, well, why are you a Christian? Well, I was raised in the church. Well, why do you believe this? Well, because my parents believe this. Well, why do you? And so there is that very hard gap that we have to break, that the faith eventually has to become their own. Okay? After Nehemiah, which then there's Malachi in there, who's the last prophet, but how many years until the time of the Messiah and John the Baptist come along? About 400 years. That's what we sometimes call the silent period. So at your last, we'll call this your last page of the Old Testament, and when you open up in the New Testament, 400 years have passed. And what's a really interesting study is what happens to Israel during those 400 years, because the Israel you meet at the end of Nehemiah and the Israel you meet in Matthew chapter 1, they are not the same Israel. Where do Pharisees come from? Where does the synagogue come from? Where do Sadducees come from? Where do all these washing of hand traditions come from? Right? Where are all these? There's a lot of rabbis that messed up a lot of things, did some good things too, in those 400 years. Okay. Whew. Any questions? But can you at least follow the storyline? Can you at least see it? This map, when you're studying, will be good. Okay, I'm reading in Samuel, and it tells you up here, okay, you're reading Samuel, so you're in this period of history. Okay? You're in Kings, you're in this period of history. And you can understand what's going on, what prophets are going on, what kings are going on. I know this is small. I know there's a lot of information on here. But the more you spend time with this chronology timeline, the more it makes sense. Okay, and there's dates, the who and the what. But when I was doing this overview, I don't care as much about this as I do you picking up the major themes of, remember these crazy 90s templates that I gave you? Those to me are more important. What's going on in each book? What are the major themes? What are the themes of Christ? Where is Christ found in this book? Okay, where's the scheme of redemption? All those kinds of things are what I tried to bring out over the last 16 weeks. Okay. We are going to start the New Testament next week. I've already got like 6 pages of notes. And I don't think I've gotten out of the introductory, like even into like Matthew yet. So I'm going to have to cut that out a little bit. We'll see you next week.